Hey everyone, welcome to class. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about operationalization, or the ways in which we actually can measure the concepts in our hypotheses. This is coming on the tail of our lectures on variables and the kinds of variables that we're going to specify in our hypotheses, right? This is our independent and our dependent variable, our cause and our effect, our X and our Y. And we also talked about functions and how they can mathematically represent the relationship between X and Y, right? The systematic relationship between X and Y. So we're going to get more into the nitty gritty of how we're going to operationalize or make possible the testing of our X's and our Y's, right? Our independent and our dependent variables. So let's get going. So how are we going to test or use data specifically to test our hypotheses, right? We're quantitative researchers, we're going to have data. Statistics is the set of practices or techniques that are used to describe, organize, and analyze data. So you probably have heard of this kind of field of statistics before. And to get a little bit more specific about what data is it's the collections of information and facts that are compiled in specific formats. And there's a few different kinds of data, and that kind of data can kind of be categorized along this framework of qualitative and quantitative that we've talked about previously. The format and the kind of data that we have determines the kinds of analysis that we can undertake. But right, this is a part of our broader research design process. So we'll be thinking about these things in advance. This is related to these concepts of foresight, right? So we know in general what sort of, if we're collecting our own data, what sort of analysis we can do based on this. But if we're using somebody else's data, this does kind of constrain and frame the sorts of analysis that we can undertake. So using this framework of qualitative and quantitative that we've done before, qualitative data is often descriptive and language-based. Think of an interview transcript. That's a really good example of qualitative data. Quantitative data is what we're going to be working with in this class, right? It's compiled in data sets, which are tables with rows and columns that have numbers that we can then use statistics on to understand the patterns in them. And we'll talk a little bit more about what quantitative data looks like, but you've probably seen or heard of an Excel spreadsheet before. That's a really good example of what a data set format looks like with rows and columns, and they often have numbers in them. So we're going to be actually looking at a little bit of Excel content moving forward before we get to R programming. So you can kind of get an understanding of what data sets look like. So obviously within this framework of quantitative analysis, after we've developed our questions and our hypotheses for those questions, right, our arguments about what's happening, we are tasked with recording or finding data about our independent and dependent variables. So in this particular class, we're going to be using pre-existing data, but you as a researcher, maybe down the line, if you have your own funding, you can collect your own data. We need to then be able to operationalize the variables in our hypotheses. So operationalizing is the task of making possible this sort of measurement and testing. So again, operationalization is the process by which we measure our variables and make possible the testing of the concepts in our hypotheses. To remind you what these concepts are, they're the broader ideas that are encompassed in our hypothesis, and we're going to be measuring stuff, right? So measurement is essentially the assignment of values to our concepts following a set of rules and systematic practices. We'll talk about what measurement looks like in the context of social science. But in testing a hypothesis, we're moving from concepts to measurements, right? And this process of moving from concept to measurement is called operationalization. So operationalization in maybe an engineering context or any sort of STEM context where they're measuring events really concretely, it can be really easy to see how they translate the numbers of occurrences of a certain system misfiring being a variable. That's very concrete on how the numbers kind of are assigned and measured, right, in that context. But in political science, when we're dealing with behavior, how do we operationalize these things that maybe seem a little bit more nebulous? Or not even behavior, what if we're thinking about attitudes or the way somebody feels about something that maybe kind of seems more qualitative, but there are ways in which we can code these things or assign values and measure them in a way that's quantitative, and we can use statistics to understand the patterns there. So the best way to explain this is through an example. So we're going to start with a working hypothesis. Remember, our working hypothesis is essentially our argument for the phenomena, and then we're going to have a null hypothesis that goes along with it in a real practice, right? So a working hypothesis for this example is an increased sense of political efficacy. Political efficacy is feeling like you can make a difference, leads to increased levels of political participation and acts like voting. So there are two different concepts, right? Our X, or independent variable, is political efficacy. So say we want to measure political efficacy. We could do something called a Likert scale, which measures in a scale level of agreement or disagreement, for example, with particular statements. So say we wanted to measure level of agreement with a particular statement, like people like me don't have a say in what government does. That's a really good example of political efficacy. That's one of the core tenets of political efficacy. And we can see how efficacious someone feels by asking them on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with this statement? With 1 being strongly agree or 5 being strongly disagree. And they can pick any discrete or set value between 1 and 5. Discrete means it's not continuous, so they can't pick 1.2 or 2.6. They have to pick 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. This method, or this kind of Likert scale of 1 to 5, is called a coding system, and it's systematic across all the respondents of your survey. So we're going to operationalize political efficacy as a Likert scale from 1 to 5, measuring the level of agreement with the statement, people like me don't have a say in what government does. We then can operationalize our understanding of political behavior or political participation and operationalize it, measuring whether or not somebody turned out to vote. So we can assign a number in how many times somebody participated in a given political action, or we can even operationalize it as a binary at 0 or 1. So for example, if we wanted to operationalize something like voting, we can assign a 0 for somebody that didn't vote, or if they say, yes, I voted and check that box, they get a 1. Another way we can measure political participation, which is the example I give you here, is attending a political rally. You can ask them to respond how many times you have attended a political rally in the last year, and they may say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can either give that as a fill in the blank box where they can write the number, or you can say, ask them to click the number that most represents the amount of events that they went to. So those are two numerical ways to measure political participation, like voting or attending political rallies. So our dependent variable, or our effect, is political participation. We're operationalizing it by measuring the number of events that person did, or whether or not they did that event or not. So there's either a binary or a discrete number of events that they went to. So again, binary is 0 or 1. And if they responded 1, that means they did that thing. So moving forward, we're going to look at an example, probably a guest lecture from Professor Mario Guerrero from the department, and he kind of explains to you the concepts of rows and columns in data sets through the lens of Excel. You can use Excel or Google Sheets. I recommend Google Sheets because you can access on any computer versus being a local file on your computer. So, and essentially that'll give you the framework for understanding what a data set is and understanding the kinds of variables you might see in a political behavior type data set.